Boa noite. Ele é paquistanês, estudou e vive em Londres e tornou-se um dos principais intelectuais de esquerda da Inglaterra. É um militante político que viaja pelo mundo numa campanha contra a política externa dos Estados Unidos. Estudioso dos conflitos e das religiões, faz uma leitura do mundo pela visão não americana e acha possível equilibrar a cultura islâmica com o cristianismo, exatamente o que não se tem hoje. Nosso convidado desta noite é Tariq Ali, romancista, historiador, dramaturgo, cineasta e ativista político. O Roda Viva começa num instante. Tariq Ali se dedica a construir o que no Ocidente poderia ser chamado de a visão do outro lado. Estuda e analisa as relações dos Estados Unidos com o Oriente, depois dos ataques terroristas de 11 de setembro em Nova York. E já produziu uma série de romances abordando o confronto entre o islamismo e a civilização cristã. Tariq Ali, que já esteve no Brasil em outras ocasiões, veio de novo agora em agosto participar da FLIP, a Festa Literária de Paraty.
Tariq Ali costuma se definir como um muçulmano não muçulmano. Ao mesmo tempo em que se posiciona contra o Império Americano, também é contra o fundamentalismo religioso. Escritor, roteirista e cineasta, Tariq nasceu no Paquistão e estudou na Universidade de Oxford, na Inglaterra, onde vive. Escreveu biografias, romances, obras de história e política internacional. Muitas obras já traduzidas para o português e lançadas no Brasil. Recentemente, na FLIP, a Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty, Tariq lançou sua última publicação, Um Sultão em Palermo, o quarto livro do Quinteto Islâmico, série que enfoca a grandeza da contribuição do Islã e seus confrontos com o Ocidente. Esse tema se tornou mais presente nos trabalhos de Tariq Ali depois dos atos terroristas de 2001 nos Estados Unidos, que marcaram profundamente o pensamento do escritor. Ele passou a estudar mais os conflitos, as religiões e a interpretar os acontecimentos por uma ótica não americana. Tido como um dos escritores que melhor traduzem para o Ocidente a complexidade da cultura do Islã, Tariq Ali faz uma campanha crítica ao governo do presidente americano George Bush, à guerra no Iraque e, mais recentemente, à guerra no Líbano. Mas, ao mesmo tempo em que ataca o Império Americano, critica também o fundamentalismo islâmico, que, segundo ele, não tem futuro. O futuro, na ideia colocada no livro Um Sultão em Palermo, estaria na construção de uma aliança pacífica entre cristãos e muçulmanos, que Tariq Ali acha possível.
Para entrevistar o escritor Tariq Ali, nós convidamos Demétrio Magnoli, geógrafo especialista em relações internacionais e editor do jornal Mundo, Geografia e Política Internacional. Roberto Lameirinhas, repórter da editoria internacional do jornal Estado de São Paulo. Vicente Adorno, comentarista internacional da Rádio Cultura FM. Samuel Feldberg, professor de Relações Internacionais das Faculdades Rio Branco e membro do GACINT, o Grupo de Análise e Conjuntura Internacional da Universidade de São Paulo. Emir Sader, sociólogo e escritor, e Oscar Pilagalo, editor da revista Entre Livros. Também temos a participação do cartunista Paulo Caruso, registrando em seus desenhos os momentos e os flagrantes do programa. O programa de hoje está sendo gravado e, portanto, não permite a participação direta do telespectador. Mas você pode mandar sua crítica, sua sugestão, sua proposta pelo site do programa. O endereço é www.tvcultura.com.br/Roda Viva. Boa noite, Tariq. Queria começar pelo seguinte: o senhor acha que é possível conciliar literatura e militância política? Que é uma longa discussão no mundo. Houve época em que isso era muito valorizado, momentos em que se considerava que não havia ligação possível, uma coisa é uma coisa e outra coisa é outra coisa, e o senhor faz ambas. É possível haver essa conciliação?
Well, I think it's always been possible. This is not something new, especially if you look at the history of Asia, Africa, and particularly Latin America, where you have had novelists running for the presidencies of Venezuela and Peru. Even, you know, what their politics are doesn't matter for this, from this point of view. They could be from the left, from the right. So literature and politics in Latin America especially has been very closely related. And then you have a big tradition in some Latin American countries of poets and novelists being sent abroad as ambassadors. You had in Brazil Jorge Amado, who was both very engaged in politics and also a very fine novelist. And the same examples I could give you from all over the world. So the connection between literature and politics is a very old one.
Agora, o senhor faz isso de maneira muito expressiva nas suas obras, né? Os seus romances históricos, eles me deram a impressão de que em determinados momentos da narrativa emerge o cenário político, o cenário cultural, o cenário, digamos, que seria de um trabalho acadêmico no meio da história. Esse casamento também funciona?
I think it works. I mean, if you look at, for instance, Tolstoy's War and Peace, you have whole chapters of very arid philosophy, one can say it. So whether it works or not, it depends on the reader, whether the reader appreciates or not. And you know, there's a big difference for me when I'm writing fiction and when I'm writing non-fiction. Because as any novelist will tell you, when you're writing fiction, it becomes partially subconscious. Even as you're writing a novel, and I've experienced this myself, lots of things come up from inside you which you didn't even know existed. And occasionally characters which you had no idea of even putting in the novel suddenly emerge and try and take the novel over, and you have to hold them back. But clearly, in this last novel I wrote, A Sultan in Palermo, I was writing this when war was raging in Iraq. And the novel is written about the 12th century, when another great Arab city, Palermo, the capital of Sicily, had fallen. So it was very difficult not to think about both items together, which, you know, to reveal the echoes of history, which are always with us. These echoes never go away, whether you're writing history, whether you're writing literature.
Mr. Tariq, here.
Hi.
Hi. Eu queria propor uma questão sobre não ficção. Na recente tentativa de atentados em Londres, o senhor disse que a responsabilidade devia ser atribuída também à política de Tony Blair. No ano passado, no 7 de julho de 2005, nos atentados terroristas contra Londres, o senhor escreveu que os londrinos, vou citar entre aspas, pagaram o preço pela reeleição de Blair e pela continuação da guerra. Ou seja, se eu li direito essa passagem, a responsabilidade aí não é nem de Tony Blair, mas dos eleitores, do povo de Londres. Eu queria saber se, do ponto de vista moral e político, o senhor é capaz de oferecer uma condenação incondicional do terror global ou é incapaz?
No, there's no problem with me. I've always been opposed to terrorism, unconditionally, whether it's terrorism carried out by individuals or whether it's terrorism carried out by states. And state terror kills more people than any group of individual terrorists have ever done in the history of humanity. You make the balance sheet of the 20th century, and you get that picture very closely. Now, in relation to Britain, when the bombings of 1 year ago happened, I denounced those bombings. I described them in my book, Rough Music, as senseless carnage. But I said you have to try and go to the causes. And explaining the causes does not mean justifying the consequences.
Mesmo se diz que a culpa é dos eleitores que reelegeram Blair?
But the people who elected Blair were opposed to the war. A majority of the British public was opposed to the Iraq war. Just 2 weeks ago, 63% of the British public said they were very upset about Blair's close links with the United States.
Mas justamente por isso eu lhe pergunto se não é o caso de dizer que toda a responsabilidade pelo terror é dos terroristas, que toda a responsabilidade pelos atos de terror em Londres, como os da Indonésia, como os atos de terror na Índia, porque a Al-Qaeda não faz terror só em Londres, como os atos de terror em Taba, no Egito, se toda a responsabilidade por esses atos, integralmente, não cabe aos terroristas, assim como a responsabilidade pela invasão do Iraque cabe integralmente aos Estados Unidos.
You cannot isolate the acts of terror that take place from the reasons that cause them. Why did the terrorists hate Britain and not France or Germany or Scandinavia?
Why?
That's the question you have to ask. And I will tell you something else, that my views are not so outlandish as you imagine. Because when I wrote the day after the July the 7th bombings in The Guardian, which is a big liberal paper, that the causes of this were the war in Iraq, I was denounced by people within the government. Within 2 weeks, a special commission set up by the British Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office said exactly the same thing. 10 days later, they did an opinion poll. 66% of the British public said the reasons for these attacks in London are Blair's foreign policy and the war in Iraq. So to say that doesn't mean you justify the terror. It means you explain the causes of it. Otherwise, the position you are defending comes down to saying these people are just totally, completely crazy. These young kids growing up in the north of England are just crazy. They are not crazy. Something drives them crazy. And these causes are what we have to stop.
Senhor Ali.
Tarek, eu gostaria só, complementando um pouco a pergunta do Demétrio, o senhor disse já que a questão do terrorismo emana muito mais da fraqueza do que propriamente da força. É uma colocação que eu acho que é aceita por muita gente, na verdade. Agora, eu não tenho certeza se é uma definição que possa ser aplicada de maneira geral ao terrorismo ou a um específico tipo de terrorismo, que é aquele que vem exatamente de grupos que estão sendo esmagados por poderes maiores. Ou é uma definição que vale de uma maneira mais ampla? Como é que o senhor vê essa definição?
Eu posso só complementar a pergunta do Oscar. Eu perguntaria ao Mr. Ali se ele considera que a democracia, nos moldes ocidentais, do modo como nós conhecemos no Ocidente, seria capaz de conter os grupos fundamentalistas que promovem o terror nos países islâmicos ou no Oriente Médio.
Well, they're two interrelated questions, and I will try and reply to Oscar's question first. There are, of course, the word terrorist itself is now becoming increasingly debased. For me, the description of an individual terrorist is very clear. Someone, either alone or with a small group, who decides to carry out acts of violence against individuals or heads of state or property with the assumption that this will bring about what they want. That is classically how we have defined acts of terrorism like this. But then you also have, throughout the 20th century, and now too, groups who are trying to fight against the occupation of their countries. Historically, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Germans, and the United States have referred to these people as terrorists, and later on they have done deals with them, they have welcomed them. When Ireland is the latest case, the IRA were called that. When the deal was done, now they're treated as statesmen. So we shouldn't mix Al-Qaeda, which is a very specific group, with other groups that exist and which are carrying out functions which it is their perfect right to carry out, resisting the occupation of their countries or defending their countries when they are under attack, which is, of course, the history of the 20th century. As to whether democracies can tackle fundamentalism, I think they can. But I think in order for them to do so, they have to understand what the basis of this is. The basis even of Al-Qaeda, which is a group I despise, I attack, I criticize all the time, I write against them. But even if you read the text of Osama bin Laden, not just a paragraph, but the speeches he makes even his position very clear, that what caused him to do this was the occupation of Saudi Arabia by US troops during the first Gulf War. And he felt this was the holy land of Islam, where you have Mecca and Medina, and these countries were now polluted. I don't agree with that, but that certainly is his opinion. So of course there is a way. You know, when the Irish bombed the hotel in Brighton and nearly killed the entire British cabinet, Within 6 weeks, the British were entering into negotiations with them to try and find the causes. Within a year and a half of that bombing, private discussions were taking place which led to a ceasefire. So we have to take each episode and try and find out why it happens. And there's a very serious American academic at the University of Chicago, Robert Pape, who has just written a book on terrorism, trying to explore the motives. And he says, in 9 cases out of 10, it's politics, not religion.
Senhor Ali, eu queria combinar 2 das suas respostas para fazer uma pergunta adicional. Em relação à responsabilidade dos eleitores ingleses, como o senhor vê a referência aos eleitores palestinos e libaneses que colocaram ou no poder ou participando do poder o Hezbollah e o Hamas, por um lado, como responsáveis por esses 2 grupos estarem no poder,
por meio de eleições democráticas.
Por meio de eleições democráticas, e segundo, se esses grupos que o senhor chama no direito de se defender da ocupação, como o Hezbollah pode ser visto nesse contexto, já que as tropas israelenses, em princípio, se retiraram do Líbano, e o último episódio do conflito entre israelenses e o Hezbollah, de certa maneira, estava ligado a uma alegação do Hezbollah de que combatem a invasão israelense.
Well, you have to understand why these people are elected. Why did Hamas win the Palestinian elections? The reason they won them was not because suddenly the Palestinians started reading the Quran 20 times a day. The reason Hamas won the elections was because the Palestinian people were fed up with the PLO, fed up with its collaboration, fed up with its corruption. And that corruption went so deep that it hurt many, many ordinary people. When you saw Palestinian leaders building large mansions for themselves while people lived in absolute penury. So it was a reaction to that they elected Hamas, because they were fed up of this. In the case of Hezbollah, it's not so dissimilar. If you look in southern Lebanon, where their base is, they are people who carry out lots of welfare activities, build schools, build hospitals, but Hezbollah derives its prestige from being the only organization which managed, after fighting, to get the Israelis to withdraw from Lebanon many years ago. And that is what gave them the prestige, which is why they're elected. But look, my own position is I am very glad they participate in elections, because they have to put their views on television in front of people. They have to face people like you and argue. And as a result of that, that draws them into the political process as a whole, and that is good, I think, for the future of that work. As to what has happened in Lebanon recently, I think it's a disaster, both for the Lebanese and for the Israelis. The figures which we now get, thousands of civilians killed in the Lebanon. The Israeli High Command announced that over 100 Israeli soldiers had died and several hundred had been wounded, or seriously or mildly. And Hezbollah announced that 62 members of Hezbollah had died in the fighting. And for what? The exchanges of political prisoners between the two sides have been taking place for many years. So Hezbollah kidnaps an Israeli. The Israelis have 9,000 Palestinian Arab prisoners in their prisons. They exchange them for 4 or 5 or 6. This has been going on for years. So they do it now, and suddenly there's a war. And I think the causes of this war are a desire, largely by Washington, to try and change the picture in Lebanon and make Lebanon into a protectorate, which is what it's been before and what they would like it to become again. So once the Syrians were pushed out of Lebanon, there was a big vacuum in that country. Who would fill the vacuum? The United States wanted to fill the vacuum, obviously, in its own interest. This is hardly a surprise. And the only group in that country capable of resisting them was Hezbollah. You look at the opinion polls coming out of Lebanon now, 60, 70% of the population thanking them. The scenes in Beirut last night, virtually the whole city out on the streets celebrating with firecrackers that we have a ceasefire and the Israelis have retreated. So the problem in the Middle East, for me, is the occupations. As long as there is no settlement on Palestine, one way or the other, either an independent Palestinian state or a single state solution on the one hand, and as long as the mess in Iraq continues, it will continue to be a very unruly region.
Vamos fazer um intervalo, lembrando que a entrevista desta noite poderá ser encomendada em DVD a partir de amanhã, como todas as outras da série Roda Viva. Para isso, você deve acessar o site www.culturamarcas.com.br ou utilizar o telefone 0 operadora 11 3081 3000. Nós voltamos no instante com Roda Viva, que esta noite tem na plateia Mariana Ferreira, estudante de jornalismo, Roberta Bardavil, tradutora e intérprete, Antônio Nacli, jornalista, diretor da Parceria 6, agência de comunicação. A gente volta já já. Voltamos com o Roda Viva, que entrevista hoje o escritor, historiador, cineasta e ativista político Tariq Ali. Lembramos que, por tratar-se de um programa gravado, não é possível a participação dos telespectadores. Mas você pode fazer sua crítica, sugestão ou comentário pela página do programa na internet. É só acessar www.tvcultura.com.br/Roda Viva e mandar o seu e-mail.
Tariq Ali tem parte de sua obra dedicada a uma questão muito presente na história humana, a transformação que a cada momento, em cada lugar, ocorre e faz a vida tomar rumos inesperados. Em Sombras da Romanceira, o primeiro livro da série Quinteto Islâmico, Tariq Ali volta ao passado muçulmano da Espanha, exatamente no momento em que os reis católicos recuperam o país no século XV, encerrando um período de 700 anos de domínio mouro na Península Ibérica. É o fim da cultura, da religião, do mundo dos muçulmanos que ali estavam e que se viram diante de uma encruzilhada: converter-se ao catolicismo ou morrer. Esse é o drama do personagem do livro. No romance Medo de Espelhos, Tariq Ali traz à tona um outro momento histórico, marcado desta vez pelas transformações que o fim da Guerra Fria trouxe na segunda metade do século XX. A queda do Muro de Berlim fez desmoronar também esperanças de uma geração criada na Alemanha comunista e que se viu igualmente numa encruzilhada. O mundo de muitas pessoas foi virado de pernas para o ar. O personagem do livro é uma delas.
Tariq, eu vou tentar falar mais um pouco de literatura, acho que não vou ter a menor chance, mas em todo caso, a impressão que eu tive lendo alguns dos seus livros é que há um personagem recorrente que aparece de diversas maneiras, que é o homem fora do seu tempo. Ele pode estar na Espanha, no final do domínio dos mouros, né? Ele pode estar na Alemanha de hoje reunificada, enfim, em vários cenários, esse homem, esse personagem mal ajeitado no momento histórico. Estou errado ou existe mesmo essa persistência?
No, you're right. There are characters like this which emerge in my fictions. In the case of Spain, it's not, of Moorish Spain, it's not exactly that they were out of time, but they were persecuted both by Christian and Muslim fundamentalists. There were lots of free thinkers. And that is a civilization, the Moorish civilization in Spain, and even before that in Portugal, which created, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful syntheses of the three cultures, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so whenever you go back and read about that period, it's very exciting that debates took place. I mean, this Muslim philosopher from Cordoba, Ibn Rushd, actually made a distinction between reason and divine truth. And for that, there were big debates in the mosques all over that region. You had women of that period, even before that, in the 10th century, writing erotic poetry and defending themselves.
Mas essas tentativas nunca deram muito certo, não duraram muito. Né? Predominou sempre a violência, a intransigência, a separação.
Well, it lasted about 400 years, which is quite a long time in history. And I think that if the Catholic Inquisition and the Reconquest had not taken place, it's very possible that the culture we have today in Europe would have been more mixed and better, and it's very possible that Islam might have had a reformation. One reason that this reformation did not take place was because it kept being pushed, and ghettoized, whereas if it had remained a European religion, who knows the shape of Europe, and who knows what South America, Latin America would have looked like.
Isso aí é uma questão que me intriga bastante, essa afirmação que o senhor fez, que o islamismo talvez tivesse um futuro um pouco melhor se ele tivesse continuado a ter raízes na Europa. Não é um pouco estranho achar que ele se perdeu justamente por voltar aos países de origem? É verdade, isso é uma coisa incontestável, que a própria Europa não tinha mais a cultura que ela tinha construído e foram os muçulmanos que levaram essa cultura de volta a ela durante a ocupação moura. Por que que tudo isso se diluiu e hoje a gente vê que nos países muçulmanos esse esplendor que teve a cultura muçulmana não existe? A gente só tem, pelo menos no Ocidente, a gente só tem uma imagem extremamente negativa. A gente não vê mais essa coisa assim da pujança de uma civilização que, em vez de se impor pelas armas, se impôs pelo intelecto.
Well, the first point to make in response to you is that all the three religions came from the same part of the world, not just Islam. Christianity was born in what is now Palestine. Judaism was born in that part of the world, and also Islam. So they all traveled. And that was considered normal, the movement of religions from one part of the world to the other, whatever the religion was. And Islamic civilization, especially in Al-Andalus and Portugal, played a very, very big part. Not just for these two countries, it acted as a bridge to the Renaissance, because without them, most of the learnings of the ancients would have been lost. These were all translated into Arabic, into Latin. There was a big school in Toledo of translators, which I wish existed today, to translate different things. So that culture was pushed out by force. Then the second big chance which Islamic civilization had was with the Ottoman period. This was the biggest empire, after all, which lasted the longest living empire. And here one has to say that the reason for the atrophying of this particular civilization was not so much external but internal. That the internal social structures of the Ottoman world and the role in particular of the clerics meant that they couldn't take from Europe what they should have taken, like the printing press, like the clock. There was always a resistance. The big story, of course, is that when enlightened Sultan in Constantinople, Istanbul, said, "Let us have the printing press." And the clerics came and said, "The printing press so people can print their own books? Look at what happened to Europe. Remember Martin Luther? Do you want a war between Islam and other factions within Islam for 200 years, as between Catholics and Protestants in Europe who've been killing each other?" So they retreated, mistakenly, but they retreated. But the links were there. And then, of course, what happened, as we all know, is that Europe, Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, Western Europe developed. Capitalism was born there, used Western Europe as a pad, and took the whole world, including this world. And by that time, it was too late for Islam or anyone else to do anything. The technological, industrial superiority of that world determined a great deal for 200 to 300 years.
Tariq, para os que lutamos por um outro mundo possível, o mundo aparece como articulado em torno de 3 eixos de poder: armas, dinheiro e palavra. Monopólio das armas, monopólio do dinheiro, monopólio da palavra. Qual desses elos é o mais forte? Qual deles que é possível mais acumular forças para criar um outro mundo possível?
Well, the world as we know it today is a world determined by and large by the Washington Consensus, its institutions, its economic policies, and these neoliberal policies are regarded now just like religious people regard their religions. You can't do anything to challenge neoliberalism. If you do, you're an extremist, you're an authoritarian, or whatever other names you want to call it, which is very sad, because this was not the case for most of the 20th century, so that now even social democracy and social democratic reforms are forbidden, not allowed, because the institutions have become so strong. And that's why the links between money and power today, in my opinion, including in Brazil, but not just in Brazil, in the United States and many parts of Western Europe, are actually beginning to affect the functioning of democracy. We have cases now in almost every major country where you have democratic institutions of how the entry of the market into politics and the utilization of money is destroying democratic politics or discrediting them, so that young people are beginning to say, why bother to vote? It changes nothing. The people with money control everything. And for the last two elections now in Great Britain, which is supposed to be the motherland of democracy, for the last two elections, a majority of people between the ages of 18 and 26 have not voted. And that is quite disturbing. And people, including people from the right, are disturbed by this, but they have no idea on what to do about it. And so the continent where these neoliberal policies were tried first, the Latin American continent, is where you saw the beginning of big social movements. And these social movements are now having an impact in Latin America. In some ways, in my opinion, when people ask me, where do you see hope? I said, you see the beginnings of hope again in Latin America, which you don't in the Middle East, because this is war-torn, religion is far too strong, and the religious groups in the Middle East, you know, they can resist, Hezbollah can resist, Hamas can resist, but their big problem is that they offer no social vision and no future to their people.
Tariq, o senhor está propondo uma ponte entre a América Latina e o Oriente Médio. E eu queria explorar essa ponte. O senhor escreveu, aliás, disse numa entrevista no 20 de setembro de 2001, pouco depois dos atentados do 11 de setembro, algo que eu concordo. O senhor fez uma comparação entre os fascistas na Europa e os islamistas radicais do Oriente Médio, dizendo que os islamistas radicais no Oriente Médio são os fascistas de lá e que têm o mesmo tipo de crenças filosóficas no sangue, no solo e na religião. Né? Eu acho que essa caracterização se aplica bem ao presidente do Irã atual, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, né? Caracterização sua, e que eu acho que se aplica a esse presidente. O senhor, quando se refere à esperança na América Latina, fala, como disse muitas vezes, de Hugo Chávez, né, na Venezuela, e das mudanças que Hugo Chávez estaria promovendo na Venezuela. Mas um dos eixos principais de política externa de Hugo Chávez hoje é uma aliança política, não é apenas cooperação econômica, mas uma aliança política, uma aliança ideológica que ele proclama do seu governo com o governo de Mahmoud Ahmadinejad no Irã. Como o senhor vê, do ponto de vista da esquerda, dos que querem mudar o mundo, uma aliança entre Hugo Chávez e Ahmadinejad?
The first point I'd make is that I think you misquote me. I have never referred to the Islamic groups as fascists. Never. Never.
Eu tenho a entrevista aqui.
No, which interview? This was... Who did the interview? Because I challenged that. In fact, I'm very careful. My characterization of these groups is Islamo-anarchists, because I compare them to the groups that existed in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, who would go and throw bombs and go and kill people. Islamo-fascists, some other people said. Francis Fukuyama said it. The quote you read out could be from Fukuyama. It's certainly not from me, and I never use words like blood and soil an attachment to that. In fact, my polemics are against people who confuse the mainstream currents of fascism which existed in Europe and which were mass currents with Al-Qaeda, which is not a fascist group, however much you dislike them. It's best to be accurate on this. So I have not characterized them as such. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran is a guy I have written about. Of course, I don't agree with him. But again, you have to ask, there were two candidates in that election. Both were clerics. One was Rafsanjani, backed by the West, totally backed by the West, and one was Ahmadinejad. And I followed the Iranian election campaign very closely. There was no foreign policy discussion at all. The big discussion was on wealth and poverty. And Ahmadinejad distributed a video showing the houses of Rafsanjani, how much wealth he had accumulated through power, and this appealed to the poor and they elected him. That is the honest fact, because people are now in many parts of these worlds desperate for something different. When he can't offer them anything, we will see, he will go, in my opinion. As far as Iran is concerned, ask yourself this. Could the United States have occupied Iraq and Afghanistan without the tacit agreement of the Iranian mullahs? Both had their reasons for getting rid of Saddam, the Iranian mullahs and the United States. Likewise, the Taliban in Afghanistan. So the Iranians and the United States collaborated. There were many, many discussions which took place between them, which we know happened. And this is now what puts the United States in a difficult position. As far as Hugo Chavez is concerned, and it's not just him, you have the situation in Bolivia now with Evo Morales. You have Mexico divided very, very sharply, with one Mexican political party saying the election was stolen from them. You have a halfway position between Chavez and Castro, represented by Nestor Kirchner. And then you have Brazil, which is still in the middle of a neoliberal sleep. But apart from Brazil, and even here you have social movements and you have many problems, as anyone reading the newspapers can tell, but in the rest of Latin America there are attempts being made, not to make revolutions like in the 60s, but to institute a set of structural reforms which help the poor. That's the big difference between these countries and religion. On a global scale, the oil-producing countries all meet and discuss their strategies. This has been happening forever. So, of course, Chavez goes to Iran and talks to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and they put up a statue of Simon Bolivar in Tehran, which is quite unbelievable. And then you have an interview with Chavez on Al Jazeera. It's watched by 26 million people. And they have tens of thousands of emails. And 90% of these emails ask the question, when will the Middle East produce a Chavez?
Mas a minha pergunta é sobre a aliança política e ideológica entre Chavez e Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, anunciada por Chavez.
Well, Chavez is trying to create a global anti-imperialist alliance against the United States. There's no doubt about that. This is quite popular in many parts of the world. It may not be in Brazil, but it certainly is popular. And so people who are opposed to US policies, economic policies and foreign policies, he says we should have a global united front so we can work together in the United Nations and here, there and everywhere. That is his perfect right to do it. And he is the only one who does it. So that when he went to make this speech and he announced it at the United Nations, even the American journalists said it's the only speech which attracted attention because everything else was banalities and cliches. And this is why, in this neoliberal world, and many Arab leaders came up and said to him, we are very glad you said it, but we can't say these things in public because we're scared.
Mas o Chavez foi recebido pelo Saddam Hussein algum tempo atrás, e o Saddam Hussein serviu até de motorista para ele, levou ele dentro daqueles Mercedões lá que ele possuía, e fez ele fazer uma viagem completa lá. Então, quem quer que seja que tiver que representar alguma coisa contra os Estados Unidos vai ser o aliado do Chavez, assim, cegamente?
But you know, Chavez visited Iraq because there was an OPEC discussion on oil. And he attacked the sanctions against Iraq, which the United Nations and the United States had imposed, which led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. So he said, we will defy your embargo. But he's not the only one who visited Chavez. There are beautiful photographs of Donald Rumsfeld and Hugo Chavez. And there are lots of beautiful photographs of Western leaders and Saddam Hussein. And Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein.
Sim, mas a pergunta é porque o senhor não vê Rumsfeld como um modelo, mas vê Chaves como um modelo. A pergunta é porque o senhor não apresenta Rumsfeld como um modelo, mas apresenta Chaves como um modelo.
No, of course, but you know, for me there are no real models really, but I think Chavez is a positive force. It's not that I'm uncritical of anyone, but I think in the world today, he is a positive force. And why should the United States determine who goes and sees a leader or not? The United States has put an embargo against Cuba. For how long? And yet Lula goes to meet Fidel Castro. Kirchner meets him. Every Latin American leader now defies the embargo. So that's what Chavez was doing in the case of Iraq, and he was not so wrong on that. Why shouldn't he go? The worst, the time when Saddam Hussein was the worst in terms of killing the Kurds, using poison gas against them, was when he was a very close ally of the West. That's the reality.
Em referência ao Iraque, o senhor é um dos maiores críticos da intervenção norte-americana no Iraque. Em uma entrevista à revista Z de março de 2006, o senhor declarou que a presença norte-americana no Iraque apoiando curdos e certos colaboradores xiitas talvez seja o maior responsável pelo processo que tende a levar a uma guerra civil no Iraque. A minha pergunta é: o Iraque estava melhor, a população iraquiana estava melhor durante o governo de Saddam Hussein, em que esses conflitos não aconteciam por uma imposição do regime iraquiano, da supremacia sunita? E qual a sua visão de um possível futuro para o Iraque, com ou sem a continuidade das tropas norte-americanas no país?
If you ask whether the Iraqi people as a whole were better off before the United States went in, I say yes. And this is also the view of many Iraqis themselves. And they will tell you that after the Gulf War of the early 90s, which was a disastrous war, but when that war was over, they said within 3 weeks, water, electricity, and our cities were functioning again. The United States has been in Iraq now for over 3 years. And still you have cities which are not functioning. So simply on the level of social order and what is available to the population, it's a complete disaster, complete disaster. Now, what will happen when the United States withdraws, as it will have to withdraw? It's difficult for it to stay there permanently. There are many things being discussed. One is a de facto division of Iraq, with Kurdistan remaining a protectorate, which it was for 12 years before Iraq was invaded, since the Gulf War, with the Kurdish tribal leaders paid a lot of money. That's a possibility. To the rest of Iraq is a completely different question. Here, if the United States leaves, it's very obvious to me what will happen, unless there's further interventions, is that the Shia parties in power will say the only country in this region we can ally with is not Saudi Arabia, which is Wahhabi, hardcore Sunnis, or Egypt or any of these countries. Our only possible ally in this region is Iran. And we will therefore make a bloc with Iran. We will have a security pact with them. We will have economic deals with them. If that happens, it will become the strongest player in the whole Middle East. Now, will the United States let this happen? We don't know. It depends on many other things. But it's basically what the American intervention has done is wrecked Iraq and destabilized the whole region, as we see in front of our eyes at the moment. So how it's going to turn out over the next 5 or 6 years will depend on many imponderables, which none of us can imagine today.
Bem, vamos fazer mais um rápido intervalo. Eu lembro a você que está em casa que pelo site www.culturamarcas.com.br ou pelo telefone 30 81 3000, código aqui de São Paulo, você pode obter os 3 livros, o melhor do Roda Viva, Internacional, Cultura e Poder, que reúnem 20 entrevistas das melhores já feitas pelo programa, em cada um desses volumes. Nós voltamos já já com o programa. Estamos de volta com Roda Viva, que esta noite entrevista o escritor, historiador, cineasta e ativista político paquistanês radicado na Inglaterra, Tariq Ali. O programa desta noite foi gravado, está sendo gravado e por isso não permite a participação dos telespectadores. Mas de todo modo, você pode fazer suas críticas, sugestões ou propostas para o programa. O endereço é www.tvcultura.com.br/Roda Viva e você manda por aí o seu e-mail. Tariq, você tem sido muito interessado na América Latina e muito crítico em relação ao governo Lula, que o senhor apoiou no início, né? O que é que faz uma pessoa ver à distância, enxergar tanto fracasso no governo do PT aqui?
The first point I'd make is that it's not such a distance, because during the years of the military rule in Brazil, many Brazilian intellectuals came to Europe, to Paris, to London, to other parts, and we used to meet them regularly and publish their essays, their writings in Europe. So we felt a very close connection with Europe. And then when the PT was established, we knew many of the people. I certainly knew many of the people involved in the founding of that party, so there was a great deal of hope that this was going to be a transformative party. And then when Lula was elected, I was here. Or just before the election, I was in Brazil seeing the enthusiasm both in Porto Alegre and in Ribeirão Preto and other places I visited. So I feel quite close to this country and many of its intellectuals and politicians. And even Cardoso used to write for the New Left Review in the 60s and 70s, essays in our magazine. So one never felt the distance. In fact, one was completely sympathetic to what Lula was trying to do. But then he was faced with a choice. And this is a choice which comes to a political leader like him or to a country once every 30 years. Are you going to use the power that you have been given by your people to try and transform the country in some way, or are you going to carry on in the same old way? And this was a choice which many of his advisors advised him, and he accepted their advice. We are going to run the country in the same old way. Once that was decided, then what we see before us is unavoidable. I mean, to see the president of Brazil on television being questioned by journalists who ask him, are you involved in the corruption? And he says, no, I'm not involved. Totally defensive. No, I'm not involved. And one of the journalists says, I don't believe you. And he just carries on repeating that. It's a very sad story, a tragedy.
Essa decepção que o senhor teve com o governo Lula tem mais a ver com a questão das acusações de corrupção ou com relação a um passado que havia do PT e que, no momento em que se tornou governo, acabou não se cumprindo? É uma coisa mais ideológica, mais relacionada à prática? Em que momento o senhor realmente sentiu que a decepção realmente chegou e falou, bom, a partir desse momento o governo não é mais o que eu esperava dele?
Well, it's not, as I'm saying, the corruption was the logical consequence of the policies and the ideology which Lula and his advisors decided to follow, which represented a break with the ideology of the PT. And what I talk when I say about ideology is nothing ultra-radical, but essentially a basic social democratic party. which had promised social democratic reforms in education, health, and you know, the state of education in this country, I come here a great deal, is appalling. It's abysmal. And if a government like a PT government can't even improve the quality of education for the majority of its citizens, then that's a big tragedy for Brazil. So what happened with the corruption was, that didn't totally surprise me. But what makes me angry, for instance, is that you have one of these advisors, total neoliberal, once a Trotskyist, now a total neoliberal like Palocci, who is facing charges. And in order to try and avoid the charges and get immunity, you try and get elected as a federal deputy, which totally discredits and disgraces Parliament once these things begin to happen, and again makes democracy something very abstract for the people. So I think it's a combination of the two that has done it.
Mas
Tariq, faz pouco mais do que ano da execução do brasileiro pela polícia britânica no metrô de Londres. Você escreveu um capítulo do teu livro sobre esse tema. Queria que você resumisse o que foi exatamente o que aconteceu e depois apurou-se pouco mais, investigou-se pouco mais sobre os acontecimentos.
What happened was a big tragedy. The police was determined to make a public display that they are tough, they are strong, to tell the people we are capable of defending you, etc., etc. So they followed the wrong guy out of a house. We don't even know out of a house in South London whether if they had followed the right guy, whether that was justified or not, because no one knows who the right guy was. But they followed this guy, a dark-skinned guy, out of his house, and they claimed they were following a terrorist who had bombs on him to blow things up. Now, this story doesn't ring true. Because if he was a terrorist, why didn't you stop him immediately? You were armed. Why did you let him board a bus? He could have blown up the bus. You followed the bus arrives at the underground station. This guy is very calm, very quiet. He has a ticket. He picks up a newspaper. He goes and sits on a train. Immediately they surround him and he's petrified. He looks scared. And then they phone someone, and another group of people board the train and shoot him dead, and they carry on shooting for 30 seconds. Now, I tell you, you look at your watch, turn it on, and just let 30 seconds pass. All that time, they shot De Menezes. So it was a public execution. That's what it was, to show people we are tough. And this poor guy died. And they have not had the decency yet to carry out a proper investigation because the policeman who killed him was suspended. They are now back at work. And what they told the inquiry is we were obeying orders.
Mesmo o prefeito de Londres gostou que não houvesse punição da execução?
The London mayor was... He was nervous at the time and should have spoken up a bit more. Ken Livingstone, because he was, tends to be sharp on these things, but he did not speak up on this question too much. And some of us spoke up. I wrote about it in the Guardian. I went and met the family when they came. We, marched with them. But there has not been a proper investigation because the proper investigation would reveal, after all, this is Britain. You don't have a group of armed policemen boarding a train and killing someone. Someone at the top gave the order. And we want to know who gave the order and why. And that still has not been made public.
E nem a imprensa questionou isso o suficiente? Nem a imprensa questionou isso o suficiente?
The press didn't question it enough. That's absolutely true. And for the first 24 hours, if you looked at the press, the entire press said terrorists shot dead in London.
Sem nenhuma apuração?
One journalist in a provincial newspaper in Scotland, the Sunday Herald, not a newspaper, one of the main newspapers, did a very good investigation. And he published it in 3 parts, and it's the best investigation, and no one mentioned it anywhere else. He's an ordinary journalist, a very honest guy, and he said this doesn't make sense. But no one noted it. I used his investigation a lot in my book and credited him. But no one said to him, come and write for us. No one interviewed him on television saying, where did you get your facts from? Because he got them.
Isso aí ratifica, a seu ver, a opinião tão má que o senhor tem da imprensa, que o senhor disse que a imprensa hoje em dia é, no mínimo, relapsa com tudo que acontece, que não existe uma posição crítica?
No, what I say is more careful. What I say is that increasingly the space in the press for dissenting opinions is becoming less and less and less. I don't say that the press is completely useless, of course not, and that applies to everywhere. But I say that if you look at some of the major newspapers in Europe today, or in Brazil, for instance, you see that there is a decline in what used to be. And this, I think, is a sad thing for the people who read these newspapers, because one of the things that creates an alert and vigilant public opinion is a press which can have different views. Otherwise, if it becomes more and more monotone, speaks in the same tone, it affects the political culture of a country, and that I find sad.
O senhor atribui isso a quê exatamente? Porque o fato é esse, hoje em dia, uma imprensa menos crítica, mais monolítica, de apoio aos seus governos, mas o fato é que até pouco tempo atrás, no final do século passado, na Guerra do Vietnã, a imprensa americana era bastante crítica. De lá para cá, não houve uma mudança estrutural muito grande nas empresas, da maneira como o noticiário chega nas redações, a parte editorial, nada disso, houve uma mudança muito grande. Nesse caso, essa mudança ela pode ser atribuída a quê exatamente?
Well, you're absolutely right. I agree with you that during the Vietnam War, the American press and American television, even more important, covered the news very well. And precisely because of that, many people in the United States, at the head of these organizations, were told in very blunt terms by the politicians and the global corporation heads that in future wars we can't do this because you demoralized our people. Look what a big anti-war movement arose in the United States, and we don't want this to happen. And if you look, there's a film recently made in Hollywood called Good Night, Good Luck, which explains how this degeneration in the American media took place. It's George Clooney's movie, very wonderful film, actually, which explains that. But there is a structural reason, and that structural reason is to do with what happened in the world after 1989. That the total collapse of the communist enemy on a global scale meant that it was no longer necessary to prove that the capitalist system was better on questions of democracy, freedom of press, right of other political parties. It was no longer a big priority. While communism existed, it was a big priority because this was an ideological divide. Look at our newspapers. We can publish communists. You can't publish anyone who defends the capitalist system.
Eu acho que o senhor faz uma bela defesa da liberdade de imprensa e da sua importância para a democracia. Da imprensa, da mídia para a democracia, e eu concordo com essa defesa. O que me deixa um pouco atônito é que, ao lado dessa defesa do papel da mídia no debate público, na democracia, o senhor defende também o regime cubano, por exemplo, onde as pessoas são presas por terem fax, por terem uma antena parabólica, por usarem um computador. São crimes. Então, quanto mais uma imprensa livre. Então, me parece que há um duplo critério permanente no seu discurso que o torna um pouco complicado para se entender. Eu queria entender melhor.
Of course, I'll try and explain it to you. For us, the Cuban Revolution was probably the most important revolution of the second half of the 20th century. What happened to this revolution? It was totally blockaded. Attempts were made to invade the country. Several attempts were made to kill its leaders because strategically and geographically it was just on the edge of the United States. This forced this revolution, compelled it to seek the help of the Soviet Union as the only other big power. And what happened in the 70s was that a lot before, if you look at the different periods of the revolution, from 1960 to 67, if you look, there were many, many more magazines, including critical magazines. Pensamiento Critico, edited by Fernando Martinez, was a very sophisticated critical magazine. After the deal with the Russians, all this process came to an end, and in my opinion, this was a tragedy for that revolution. And I've said it to the Cubans themselves. I'm not saying it just in a television studio in Brazil, that this was a tragedy. The fact that writers were locked up for their opinions was both unnecessary and tragic. And it shouldn't have happened. But if from that you ask me, so then do you want this regime overthrown by the United States? And I will, yeah, fine, good, okay.
Senhor Ali, eu queria voltar ao Oriente Médio. O senhor mencionou aqui que a condição básica para uma solução dos problemas do Oriente Médio passa pela solução do problema palestino, ou através da criação de um Estado palestino independente, ou, eventualmente, através da chamada solução de um Estado comum. Primeiro, como o senhor vê a fronteira possível entre Israel e um Estado palestino independente? E, se não, o senhor acredita realmente na possibilidade da existência de um Estado único para ambas as populações que possa se manter democrático?
Well, look, the situation now has become so bad in Palestine that anything we say sounds utopian. Almost any solution you come up with sounds, how can we ever achieve this? But if one wants to start thinking seriously, depending on what solution you favor, all my political life, most of my life, I favored a solution of one state for Jews and Muslims and Christians, like Jerusalem became after the Crusaders were expelled in the 12th century. A city for everyone and a state for everyone. So people maintain their cultural identity, their political voices, but they work in a single state. This proved to be impossible. When this proved to be impossible, I said, okay. I talked to many, many Palestinians and Israelis. I have very close Israeli friends. And I said, in that case, if you feel this is impossible, then we need a Palestinian state, which is a proper state. And for Palestine to be a proper state, it needs, for a start, accepting that Israel returns to the 67 frontiers. That is not going to happen. It is obvious now that that's not going to happen. So once again, the question of a single state solution is coming up. And I think after this disaster in Lebanon for the Israelis, many people in Israel will be saying, what are we going to do to last till the end of this century? We can't carry on like this. There's a very famous left-wing historian, Isaac Deutscher, who initially was sympathetic to Zionism. And after the 1967 war, he publicly broke, and he said, you're becoming like the Prussians. And he warned them. He said, please remember there is an old German saying, you can triumph yourself to death. And do not swallow what you can't digest. And I think this was the best possible advice he gave them. But now the situation is completely out of control, in my opinion. So I can't see if I met some people from Hamas in London not so long ago. They said, what would you do in our place today? I said, what I would do in your place today is dissolve the Palestinian Authority, because it's a joke. It doesn't exist. Say we are all now citizens of whatever entity you want to call it, and wage a civil disobedience campaign. Stop the suicide bombings. Stop any violent confrontation. Just behave like many other people have done in colonial situations and demand equal rights.
E quem não está interessado nesse tipo de solução?
They were silenced. They didn't say anything. No, they didn't sort of reject it. They said, it's interesting what you say, but you don't understand our situation. It's very difficult. The Israelis come and arrest our parliamentarians, lift us, the level of brutality is far too great. So I said, I know all that. And because I know all that, I suggest to you that you dissolve the Palestinian Authority because it doesn't exist. You can't do anything. You're treated worse than an NGO. So in this situation, what do you have to lose? Say we are citizens and we want equal rights, and then let's see where it goes.
Tarek, vamos fazer mais um rápido intervalo, lembrando que o Roda Viva desta noite, todos os outros programas da série, mais de 1000 programas já realizados aqui pela TV Cultura, podem ser encomendados em DVD. Para isso você acessa o site www.culturamarcas.com.br ou o telefone 0 operadora 11 30 81 3000. A gente volta já já. Você vê hoje no Roda Viva a entrevista com o escritor, historiador, cineasta e militante político Tariq Ali. Paquistanês, radicado na Inglaterra, ele é representante da nova esquerda globalizada. Um intelectual que tem se dedicado a estudar e traduzir para o Ocidente o complexo mundo do islamismo. Tariq Ali é autor de vários livros, muitos deles voltados para a análise crítica das relações justamente entre os Estados Unidos e o Oriente. Tariq, o senhor recentemente, neste evento literário do Paraty, foi vaiado por parte do público, segundo a imprensa noticiou. Eu imagino que, com essa sua militância e essa peregrinação constante, defendendo alguns pontos de vista que não necessariamente são aqueles que estão na moda, isso deve acontecer com alguma frequência. O senhor não sente, às vezes, um peixe fora d'água, como se diz aqui no Brasil? Quer dizer, alguém que está indo contra a corrente, quando talvez fosse mais fácil pensar de outro jeito?
Well, first, let me tell you that there were some people in my talk in Parachi, which was attended by, 1,000 people. Some people asked hostile questions. I was not jeered. In fact, I received a very strong and warm welcome from the overwhelming majority of the audience. But I'm used to being, I'm not worried about being asked hostile questions or being forced to explain my position, because we have to do it. It's what we expect of others. So why shouldn't we accept hostile criticism, etc.? But this criticism should be based on some reality, not an imaginary position ascribed to us that we don't hold. So that sometimes makes me angry when people accuse me of holding views I obviously don't hold in order to strengthen their case. And there have been one or two examples of this in the media globally and in Brazil, but it doesn't bother me much. I don't think about all that. I basically, when I'm asked a question, try and speak the truth. And I think I do. And that sometimes angers people, because the truth these days can be painful to some points of view.
O senhor se sente órfão do trotskismo?
No, I don't feel an orphan at all of Trotskyism or any other ism. I feel very independent-minded. I mean, I decided in the 80s, when I was no longer politically engaged with any group, that I was not going to be apolitical. That was never a question. And the magazine I'm associated with, the New Left Review, has been a critical magazine now for nearly 50 years. I've been associated with it for 25 years. And so we have a collection, an intellectual collective, where we exchange views, we discuss with each other, and this magazine is now published every 2 months, not just in English but in Spanish, and annually it's published in Portuguese in Brazil, and in other parts of the world, in Turkey, and editions are going to be published in Arabic. So I feel quite sort of strengthened by the fact that we have managed to preserve this tradition in bad times, when you had a whole wave passing over a generation and turning them upside down, so that people who were very radical in many cases are today extremely reactionary.
Tariq, você considera que a frase do Sartre, de que o marxismo é a filosofia insuperável do nosso tempo, continua a ser válida?
Sartre. Did you say Sartre?
Jean-Paul Sartre.
Jean-Paul Sartre, yes. Well, I mean, I think that Sartre was someone who inspired us a great deal in the late 50s and 60s. I personally am not an existentialist and never have been in that sense. But there was a courage about him which I loved very much, and the fact that he could stand up and take a position on issues like the Algerian War, for instance, at a time when most of France, including many communists, remained silent. Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir spoke and took a position on that, and many, many other things that he did. His philosophy did have an impact on some of us, but less on me, more on my other colleagues.
Não, a questão é se continua a ser verdadeira a afirmação de que o marxismo é a filosofia insuperável do nosso tempo. Se essa afirmação para você continua a ser válida.
Yes, it's valid if it is not treated like a religion or treated dogmatically. I mean, how can one discard many of the, if you like, intellectual discoveries made by Marx? And often when I read some of Marx again, it's very, very exciting reading that. But what I don't like, and what I never liked, was the utilization of Marx's writings or other writings in that tradition as a religion. And there was a very strong tradition of that within the left, that if you were arguing with someone in the old days, all you had to do was to cite a quotation, and that was considered enough. And that you can't, it was wrong even then, but now it's impossible to behave like that. You have to argue the case. And of course, Marx, Trotsky, people like that, their writings are very useful still.
Falando da esquerda globalizada, que o Marcum, uma expressão interessante do Marcum, no Manifesto de Porto Alegre, que o senhor assinou em 20 de fevereiro de 2005 no Fórum Social Mundial, junto com 18 intelectuais, um deles o Emir Sader, que está aqui, o Frei Beto, também brasileiro, tem algumas passagens que me deixaram curioso. Numa delas, o manifesto pede que se removam todas as tropas estrangeiras do mundo, exceto aquelas sob o explícito mandato da ONU. Ou seja, a remoção de todas as tropas de ocupação estrangeiras, menos aquelas que estão sob mandato da ONU. E numa outra passagem, o manifesto pede que o Banco Mundial e o Fundo Monetário Internacional e a Organização Mundial de Comércio sejam incorporadas ao sistema da ONU. O senhor aqui hoje disse que sob ordens da ONU, o Iraque permaneceu sob sanções terríveis, né, para a sua população. Então, eu queria entender, a ONU tem um órgão de poder que é o Conselho de Segurança, suas 5 potências. Eu queria entender por que a esquerda globalizada gosta tanto da ONU.
Well, I have to confess something to you now. When you are signing a resolution like that, you will never find total agreement. And you have then to make a choice whether in the overall judgment of things it's better to sign or not to sign. I don't like those passages to which you refer, and I don't even agree with them necessarily. That's my position, and I think that it's
O senhor acha que a maioria de quem assinou concorda com isso?
So,
eu também não concordo.
Well, I'm not sure most people agree with that, because increasingly now, even since that resolution, the United Nations is exposed more and more as an instrument of the Security Council. And the Security Council is an instrument of the United States by and large. The overwhelming majority of members of the United Nations have no say in anything. And this is why a reform of the UN is something which many people are asking for. For instance, why isn't India, South Africa, Brazil members of the Security Council in their own right? But the United States will not agree to that, because it will not agree to a system where they could lose control. So that's not going to happen, and I think the United Nations is going to remain what it is unless something unforeseeable happens.
O senhor acha que a Rússia e a China sim concordariam com essa mudança, ou essa é uma posição comum de pelo menos 3 grandes potências que não têm interesse nessa mudança?
The problem with Russia and China is that they essentially, the only things they defend in the Security Council are their own interests. Where their own interests aren't involved, they go along with the United States. And in return for backing the United States on issue 1, 2, 3, they get backing from the United States on issue 4, 5, and 6, which concerns them. There is not a single power in the Security Council who one could say has a principled foreign policy. It doesn't exist.
Tarek, última pergunta, que pode parecer uma pergunta de programa de auditório, mas eu vou fazê-la. Seus livros de literatura são romances históricos, basicamente. Quer dizer, olham para trás. Quando o senhor olha para frente, em termos da perspectiva da sociedade, o senhor é otimista?
Well, I mean, when I look at some of the developments in Latin America, it does give cause for optimism. And my latest book, which is not a novel, but which is a work of politics and history, is on Latin America. It's called Pirates of the Caribbean, An Axis of Hope, and it's about Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. There are also references to the Lula experience in Brazil. And I would never have spent, a year working on producing this book if I didn't feel a sense of hope in this continent. But I think this is where it is. And I say this even when I'm in the Middle East or in other parts of the world. Just see what's going on in Latin America. Who knows, it might produce something which could be beneficial for the whole world.
Tarek Ali, muito obrigado pela sua entrevista, obrigado aos nossos entrevistadores aqui e a você que está em casa, e nós estaremos aqui na próxima segunda-feira com mais um Roda Viva. Uma ótima semana e até segunda.